January 1978. Somewhere inside the criminal world of Hell's Kitchen, a man named Richard Taziello had become a problem. He owed money, and the men collecting it were not interested in extensions. According to federal court records, James Coonan, Mickey Featherstone, and Tony Lusich murdered Taziello. Then they dismembered his body. This was not an isolated explosion of violence. Less than a year earlier, another man had met a horrifyingly similar fate. Charles Ruby Stein was a major loansharking financier. Jimmy Coonan owed him a substantial amount of money. In May 1977, Coonan and other members of his crew murdered Stein. Then they cut his body apart. This was the reputation the Westies cultivated in Hell's Kitchen. Not simply that they would kill, but that crossing them could end in a way people would remember. Years later, Hollywood would take this world and turn it into State of Grace. Ed Harris played Frankie Flannery, the cold, calculating Irish mob boss, trying to hold together a neighborhood crew while dealing with a much larger Italian mafia family. Gary Oldman played Jackie Flannery, his unstable and terrifying younger brother. The movie was violent, dark, fatalistic. But here is the first thing you need to know about the story behind it. Frankie Flannery never existed. There was no real Frankie running Hell's Kitchen under that name. The character was fictional, but the criminal world that made him believable was not. State of Grace drew heavily from the history of the Westies, the Irish-American organized crime group that dominated much of Hell's Kitchen's underworld during the 1970s and 1980s. And the real figure closest to Frankie Flannery was a man named James "Jimmy" Coonan. Under Coonan, the Westies made money from loan sharking, narcotics, union extortion, gambling, and control connected to the West Side peers. They also built something harder to measure: fear. Federal appellate judges later described the gang as deliberately cultivating a reputation for barbarism. That reputation was not created by a screenwriter. It was built through actual violence, actual murders, actual bodies, and eventually, an alliance with one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. So if State of Grace made Frankie Flannery look dangerous, understand what Hollywood was working with. It invented the man, but it did not invent the terror. And to understand how Jimmy Coonan became powerful enough to inspire a character like Frankie, we have to go back before the Westies even existed. Back to a Hell's Kitchen controlled by another Irish boss, a man named Mickey Spillane, and a teenage Jimmy Coonan who decided that boss had to fall. Frankie Flannery feels real because the world around him was real. That is the trick. State of Grace pulls better than almost any Irish mob film of its era. Ed Harris plays Frankie as a neighborhood boss caught between two forces. On one side, the Irish crew he grew up with. On the other, a much larger Italian mafia organization that offers money, protection, and survival. But only if Frankie accepts that he is no longer fully independent. That tension came directly from history. The American Film Institute notes that State of Grace was loosely based on alliances formed in the 1970s between the Westies and the Gambino crime family. The connection was so direct that during pre-production, the movie's working title was Westies, but the filmmakers did not make a documentary. They built fictional characters inside a real criminal framework. Frankie Flannery was one of those characters. There is no historical Westies boss by that name. The closest real-world parallel is Jimmy Coonan. Like Frankie, Coonan became a dominant Irish mob figure in Hell's Kitchen. Like Frankie, he operated in a world where a smaller neighborhood organization had to deal with a far more powerful Italian mafia structure. And like Frankie, his authority depended on balancing fear inside his own crew with relationships outside it. But that does not make Frankie a biography of Coonan. The movie redistributes real history. It compresses people. It moves motives. It turns criminal alliances into personal drama. And it gives the audience a family they can follow. The same thing happens with Jackie Flannery. Gary Oldman plays Jackie as explosive, unstable, violent, and impossible for Frankie to completely control. That character strongly echoes Mickey Featherstone, the real Westie, who became one of Jimmy Coonan's most important men. Featherstone was not Coonan's brother, but in State of Grace, making Jackie Frankie's brother transforms a dangerous criminal partnership into something more emotionally immediate. Now, every act of violence is also a family crisis. Every argument becomes betrayal. Every decision has blood behind it. That is Hollywood doing what Hollywood does best. It takes a criminal organization and turns it into a household. But the real Westies were not a household. They were an enterprise. And federal court records describe something much colder than the family tragedy on screen. Under Coonan, the Westies became one of the dominant organized crime groups in Hell's Kitchen. Mickey Featherstone became his second in command. The crew made money through loansharking, narcotics, labor union extortion, gambling, and criminal control connected to the West Side peers. They also deliberately built a reputation for extreme violence. That is the real foundation beneath State of Grace. Frankie Flannery never existed. Jackie Flannery never existed. But Jimmy Coonan did. Mickey Featherstone did. The Westies did. And the neighborhood war that created them began long before Hollywood turned Hell's Kitchen into a family drama. Before Jimmy Coonan. Before Mickey Featherstone. Before the Westies became a name that frightened prosecutors and rival gangsters alike, there was Hell's Kitchen, a hard strip of Manhattan running west toward the Hudson River. For generations, the neighborhood had been shaped by working-class families, crowded tenements, railroad lines, warehouses, docks, bars, and the constant movement of goods through New York's waterfront. Irish immigrants had settled there in large numbers during the 19th century. Many found work on the docks. Others worked the railroads, construction jobs, warehouses, and the countless businesses that grew around the river. This matters because Hell's Kitchen was not valuable to criminals simply because it was poor. It was valuable because things moved through it. Cargo, labor, trucks, ships, construction money, union jobs, cash. And whenever an industry depends on who gets hired, who gets access, who gets a contract, or which truck is allowed through a gate, there is an opportunity for someone to sell influence. That was the economic foundation beneath the neighborhood's criminal history. Long before the Westies, Hell's Kitchen had already produced gangs. During Prohibition, warehouses and waterfront access helped support illegal liquor operations. After Prohibition ended, organized crime did not disappear. It adapted. Gambling, loansharking, extortion, union pressure, control over jobs. The product changed. The logic did not. If you could influence the men working the docks, you could influence the waterfront. If you could influence the waterfront, you could pressure businesses that depended on it. And if you could convince people that refusing you would cost them money, work, or safety, you did not need to own the company. You only needed leverage. By the middle of the 20th century, one Irish mob figure had become closely associated with that kind of neighborhood power. Michael "Mickey" Spillane, not the writer, the gangster. Spillane became an important underworld figure in Hell's Kitchen and specialized in extortion. His power was rooted in something the Italian mafia families understood very well: local control. A neighborhood boss did not have to rule New York City. He needed to know who mattered on a few blocks, which bars were useful, which unions had influence, which contractors needed labor, which politicians could be approached, which people could be frightened, and which people could not. That kind of power could look small on a map, but economically, it could be extremely valuable. Hell's Kitchen sat beside one of the busiest commercial cities in the world. Every pier, construction project, trucking route, and union relationship represented money moving through territory. And territory is exactly what organized crime fights over. But the neighborhood was already changing. By the 1960s and 1970s, redevelopment pressure was increasing. Parts of the old waterfront economy were weakening. Containerization would eventually reduce the importance of many Manhattan piers. Working-class families were being pushed by rising development pressure. The old Hell's Kitchen was beginning to disappear. That made the remaining criminal territory more valuable, not less. Because men who had built their identities around neighborhood control could see the future arriving, and they did not intend to surrender quietly. Mickey Spillane represented the old order: a local Irish boss, neighborhood relationships, extortion, political connections, control built over years. Then a younger man came after him, Jimmy Coonan. And Coonan did not look at Spillane as an institution to respect. He looked at him as the man standing in the way. According to later accounts, the hatred between them became deeply personal. It involved Jimmy's father, an alleged kidnapping, a beating, and a humiliation that Coonan would never forget. Whether every detail of that story can be documented is another question, but the result is not. Jimmy Coonan grew up to challenge Mickey Spillane for Hell's Kitchen, and when that challenge began, the neighborhood stopped being merely territory. It became a battlefield. Jimmy Coonan did not begin by wanting to run Hell's Kitchen. He began by wanting revenge. At least, That is how the story has been told for decades. Coonan was born in 1946 and grew up in Hell's Kitchen, in an Irish-American household that was not, on the surface, built for organized crime. His father, John Coonan, worked as an accountant. The family lived in a modest apartment on West 49th Street. Jimmy was not born into a mafia family. He was not handed a crew. He did not inherit territory. But according to later accounts, something happened when he was still a young man that changed the direction of his life. His father was kidnapped. The man blamed for it was Mickey Spillane, the reigning Irish mob boss of Hell's Kitchen. Spillane had a reputation for using kidnapping and intimidation against local businessmen and merchants. According to the version repeated by organized crime writers, John Coonan was pistol-whipped and badly beaten during the ordeal. For Jimmy, the humiliation was personal. His father had been taken, beaten, made powerless. And the man believed responsible was the neighborhood boss everyone else was supposed to fear. The story became central to how Coonan's rise was later explained. But this is where we have to be careful. We have later histories. We have repeated accounts. We have writers who identify the incident as a major motive. What we do not have is the same kind of documentary certainty we have for Coonan's later federal convictions. So it is better to say this. According to the underworld history that survived, Jimmy Coonan believed Mickey Spillane had humiliated his father, and Jimmy did not forget it. By his late teens, Coonan was already developing a reputation of his own. He boxed, he fought, he dropped out of school, and rather than treating Spillane as the established authority of Hell's Kitchen, he began treating him as an enemy. That distinction matters. Most young criminals survive by attaching themselves to power. Coonan did the opposite. He began positioning himself against the man who already had it. Later accounts describe him buying a machine gun and trying to ambush Spillane from a rooftop. Whether every detail of those early episodes can be reconstructed perfectly is less important than what followed. Coonan was no longer merely angry. He was committed. A teenager had decided that the neighborhood boss had to be removed. That was almost suicidal. Spillane had years of relationships, money, men, political access, union connections, a reputation. Coonan had youth, rage, and a growing circle of neighborhood toughs. On paper, the contest should have ended quickly. It did not. And that tells us something important about Coonan. His ambition did not depend on being stronger at the beginning. It depended on surviving long enough to become stronger later. That is how neighborhood wars change. At first, one side controls the bars, the jobs, the money, the people who matter. The challenger controls almost nothing. Then one lieutenant switches sides. One rival disappears. One arrest removes somebody important. One killing changes the balance. And suddenly the old boss is still feared, but no longer untouchable. That was the transformation beginning in Hell's Kitchen. Mickey Spillane represented a criminal order built over years. Jimmy Coonan represented something younger, more reckless, more personal, and eventually, more violent. The feud that began as a grievance would grow into a struggle for control of the entire neighborhood. And once Coonan decided he was no longer just seeking revenge, the question changed. It was no longer, how does a young man hurt Mickey Spillane? It became, how does he replace him? Jimmy Coonan's first war against Mickey Spillane did not look like the rise of a future mob boss. It looked reckless. Spillane already had the neighborhood. He had the rackets, the relationships, the political access, the older men who understood how Hell's Kitchen worked. Coonan had anger, a small circle of young street criminals, and the willingness to attack someone everyone else had learned to live with. In 1966, when Coonan was still barely out of his teens, later accounts say he opened fire with a machine gun from the roof of a Hell's Kitchen tenement at Spillane and men around him. He failed to kill anyone, but failure was not the only message. The message was that Jimmy Coonan was willing to shoot at Mickey Spillane. That alone changed how people had to think about him. Because neighborhood power depends on assumptions. You assume the boss is protected. You assume younger men will fall in line. You assume that if someone attacks the boss and fails, he will disappear. Coonan refused to disappear, but he did go to prison. In 1967, he was convicted after a homicide case and received a sentence that removed him from Hell's Kitchen for several years. For an ambitious street criminal, that should have ended the story. Prison does not just take away freedom, it freezes momentum. While you are gone, other men earn money. Other men make alliances. Other men take your place. And Mickey Spillane remained the established name on the West Side. But when Coonan returned in the early 1970s, he resumed the conflict. Now he was older, more experienced, and no longer alone. Young neighborhood criminals began gathering around him. Men who did not see Spillane as an untouchable institution. They saw an aging power structure. Among the most important was Francis "Mickey" Featherstone. Featherstone would eventually become Coonan's second-in-command. And unlike the fictional brotherhood in State of Grace, their real partnership was based on criminal usefulness. Coonan needed men willing to act. Featherstone needed a structure in which violence could become status. Together, they were part of a younger faction trying to replace the old West Side order. The timing mattered. Spillane's position was weakening. Hell's Kitchen itself was changing. The waterfront was changing. Construction money was changing the value of territory. And Italian organized crime families were paying increasing attention to the West Side. That created a problem Spillane could not solve with neighborhood loyalty alone. His territory was becoming valuable to organizations much larger than his own. And once that happens, a local boss faces two enemies: the challenger inside the neighborhood and the power outside it. By the mid-1970s, Spillane was under pressure from both. Several of his important associates were killed. Later mob histories tie those killings to outside mafia interests seeking greater access to West Side construction and rackets. Spillane eventually moved his family out of Hell's Kitchen to Queens. That move did not mean he instantly surrendered his influence, but symbolically, it mattered. A neighborhood boss had left the neighborhood, and Jimmy Coonan was still there. That is how power begins to transfer before anyone officially announces it. The old boss still has a name. The younger boss has the streets. The old boss still has history. The younger boss has men willing to kill. The old boss still has relationships. The younger boss starts building new ones. By 1977, the conflict reached its final stage. On May 13, Mickey Spillane was shot and killed outside his apartment in Queens. The murder has long been attributed in underworld histories to Roy DeMeo and his crew, allegedly acting in a way that benefited Coonan. That attribution should not be confused with a courtroom finding that Coonan personally ordered or carried out the murder. But the consequence is undeniable. Spillane was dead, the man who had ruled Hell's Kitchen was gone, and Jimmy Coonan emerged as the dominant Irish mob figure in the neighborhood. For more than a decade, he had treated Spillane first as an enemy, then as an obstacle. Now the obstacle was gone. But taking Hell's Kitchen was only the beginning, because Coonan was about to discover something Spillane had resisted. A small Irish crew could fight the Italian mafia, or it could do business with it. And Coonan chose business. Mickey Spillane's death did not create Jimmy Coonan. It confirmed him. By the late 1970s, the balance of power in Hell's Kitchen had shifted. The old boss was gone. The younger crew was still standing, and the men around Jimmy Coonan were no longer simply a group of neighborhood toughs trying to survive a feud. They were becoming an organization, the Westies. The name would eventually become shorthand for one of the most violent Irish-American criminal groups in New York. But what made the Westies powerful was not violence alone. Violence protected the business, and the business gave the violence a purpose. Under Coonan, the gang made money through loansharking, illegal gambling, narcotics, extortion, union rackets, and influence connected to the West Side peers. That combination mattered because Hell's Kitchen was still valuable territory. Construction projects meant contracts. Contracts meant labor. Labor meant unions. Unions meant access. And access could be turned into money. If a contractor needed workers, someone could pressure the union. If a business needed peace, someone could sell protection. If a borrower needed cash quickly, a loan shark could provide it. And if the borrower could not repay, the debt did not disappear. It became leverage. This is where Coonan's Westies were different from the romantic idea of an Irish street gang. They were not simply men sitting in bars waiting for a fight. They were extracting money from systems, jobs, debt, construction, gambling, drugs, the waterfront, and because none of those arrangements came with legal contracts, fear became the enforcement mechanism. Federal court records later described the Westies as deliberately cultivating a reputation for barbarism. That phrase matters. They did not merely commit violent acts. The reputation itself had value. If people believed the Westies would kill over a debt, fewer people challenged the debt. If people believed they would retaliate against a witness, fewer people talked. If union officials believed resistance could bring violence, negotiation became easier. The story of the Westies was therefore not simply a body count. It was a business model in which violence reduced resistance, and Coonan sat at the center. The government later described him as supervising the gang's activities and receiving a large share of the criminal proceeds. That tells us what kind of boss he had become. He did not need to participate personally in every extortion. He did not need to collect every debt. He did not need to stand beside every drug transaction. The organization could generate money beneath him. His value was coordination, authority, connections, and the ability to decide who inside the crew mattered. Among those men, nobody mattered more than Mickey Featherstone. By the middle of the 1970s, Featherstone had become Coonan's right-hand man, his second in command. That relationship would become one of the central engines of the Westies. Coonan provided structure. Featherstone provided violence. Together, they helped create a gang whose small size disguised how much fear it could generate. And that is one of the biggest differences between the real Westies and the Flannery crew in State of Grace. The movie makes the organization feel like a family. The real Westies were closer to a compact criminal machine. A handful of men could control more territory than their numbers suggested because everyone around them understood the consequences of resistance. But there was a limit to what a small Irish gang could do alone. New York's Italian mafia families had more money, more manpower, more political reach, and far deeper organized crime infrastructure. Coonan could either resist that reality, as Spillane had tried to do, or he could make himself useful to it. The decision would change the Westies permanently, because once Jimmy Coonan connected his crew to the Gambino crime family, Hell's Kitchen stopped being only a neighborhood story. The Westies were about to become part of something much bigger. If Jimmy Coonan was the man who gave the Westies structure, Mickey Featherstone was the man who gave them fear. His full name was Francis Thomas Featherstone, but almost everyone knew him as Mickey. He was born in Hell's Kitchen in 1948, one of 9 children in a working-class Irish-American family. And before he became a gangster, he tried to become something very different, a soldier. According to later biographical accounts, Featherstone enlisted in the army as a teenager and hoped to join the Green Berets. But his military career did not become the heroic story he imagined. He struggled. There were disciplinary problems, reports of hallucinations, psychological instability, and eventually, a medical discharge. When he returned to Hell's Kitchen, he came back to the same neighborhood Coonan was trying to take over. But Featherstone was not simply another street tough. He had become unpredictable. Heavy drinking made that worse. So did the psychological problems that followed him into adulthood. He spent time in mental institutions. He was involved in violent incidents. And in 1971, he killed a man outside a bar. He was found not guilty by reason of insanity. That case did not make him disappear. It made his reputation darker. By the mid-1970s, Featherstone was spending time around the same Hell's Kitchen bars and criminal circles that fed men into Jimmy Coonan's organization. Coonan saw something useful in him: violence, loyalty, and, perhaps most important, willingness. The Westies were fighting for control of a neighborhood. They did not need a polished businessman. They needed someone other people were afraid to confront. Featherstone became that man. Federal court records later identified him as Coonan's right-hand man and second in command. That is not movie mythology. That is how the government described the Westies' actual hierarchy. And it is why comparisons with Jackie Flannery in State of Grace are so tempting. Gary Oldman plays Jackie like a man whose emotions are always 1 second away from becoming violence. He is reckless, loyal, paranoid, funny one moment, terrifying the next. That does not make Jackie a biography of Mickey Featherstone. But the resemblance is obvious enough that the fictional character feels like a compressed version of the real role Featherstone played inside Coonan's world. There was one major difference. Jackie and Frankie are brothers. Mickey Featherstone and Jimmy Coonan were not. Their bond was criminal, not biological, and that made it more fragile. For a time, the partnership worked. Coonan could make decisions. Featherstone could enforce them. Together, they helped create the reputation federal judges later described as barbaric. But Featherstone was not merely someone who stood behind Coonan during threats. He participated directly in the violence that made the Westies feared. In January 1978, federal appellate records say Coonan, Featherstone, and Tony Lusich murdered Richard Tassiello, a loansharking customer who had fallen behind in his payments. Then they dismembered him. That single case tells us what Featherstone had become. Not simply an unstable man in a violent neighborhood, not simply Coonan's friend. a senior participant in an organized criminal enterprise where murder could serve an economic purpose. But there was another side to Featherstone that would eventually matter more than his violence. He had limits. He had resentments. And he did not always agree with the direction Coonan was taking the gang. As the Westies moved closer to the Gambino family, the relationship between the two men became more complicated. Coonan saw the Italians as leverage, protection, money, a way to make a small Irish crew more powerful than its size should have allowed. Featherstone was less comfortable with the arrangement. That disagreement did not destroy them immediately, but it planted something dangerous. Because the same man who helped Coonan build the Westies would eventually become the government's most valuable witness against them. And before that betrayal could happen, Coonan and Featherstone would commit one of the killings that defined the gang's reputation forever. The murder of Charles Ruby Stein. Charles Ruby Stein was not some random man who crossed the Westies in a bar. He was money. Stein was a loan-sharking financier, the kind of man who existed behind the visible layer of street crime. He supplied capital. Other criminals borrowed from him. Money moved outward at interest. Debts moved back toward him. And one of the men who owed Stein a substantial amount of money was Jimmy Coonan. That made Stein dangerous in a very specific way. A creditor does not need a gun to control a debtor. He only needs the debt to remain unpaid. As long as Coonan owed Stein money, Stein possessed leverage. And leverage is exactly what a rising crime boss does not want another man to possess. In May 1977, that problem was eliminated. Federal appellate records say Coonan, William, Billy Beatty, and other members of the Westies murdered Stein. Then they dismembered his body. That detail is not underworld legend. It appears in the court record, and it tells us something essential about how the Westies operated. The killing was not simply emotional. It solved a financial problem. A man Coonan owed money to was dead. The debt could no longer be collected in the ordinary way. But the murder did something else. It sent a message. This is where the Westies' reputation becomes part of the business model. Most criminal organizations use violence. The Westies cultivated the idea that their violence would be extreme. Federal judges later described the gang as having deliberately built a reputation for barbarism. That word matters. Barbarism is not just killing. It is making sure the killing becomes a story. A shooting can remove one enemy. A mutilated body can frighten 10 others. That is the logic. The audience should not confuse that with admiration. It is coercion. The purpose of fear is to make people calculate differently. A borrower asks whether missing a payment is worth the risk. A union official asks whether refusing a demand is worth the risk. A witness asks whether talking to police is worth the risk. A rival asks whether entering Hell's Kitchen is worth the risk. The Westies did not need to attack everyone. They needed enough people to believe that they might, and Stein's death fed that belief. The timing was also important. This was 1977. The same year, Mickey Spillane was killed. The old order in Hell's Kitchen was collapsing. Coonan was moving toward undisputed leadership, and the Westies were becoming more than a crew with a neighborhood reputation. They were becoming an organization with money, hierarchy, territory, and external relationships. But a small Irish gang still had one serious weakness: capital. A loan-sharking operation needs money to lend. Extortion can generate cash. Gambling can generate cash. Drugs can generate cash. But expanding those businesses requires deeper reserves. That is where the Italian mafia changed the equation. The Westies were violent enough to be useful. They controlled a valuable neighborhood. They had influence around the West Side, but they were still small. The Gambino crime family was not. Federal court records later showed that the Gambinos agreed to finance the Westies' loan-sharking operation. They also allowed the Westies to use the Gambino name and reputation in their own criminal business. In return, the Westies paid the Gambino family 10% of proceeds from various illegal activities. Think about what that meant. Coonan no longer had only his own reputation behind him. Now he could invoke one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. The Westies supplied local violence. The Gambinos supplied money, status, and a much larger shadow. For Jimmy Coonan, that was a transformation. He had started as a teenager attacking the man who ruled his neighborhood. Now he was leading the dominant Irish gang in Hell's Kitchen and entering into business with the Italian mafia. The murder of Ruby Stein showed what the Westies were willing to do to solve a financial problem. The Gambino alliance would show what happened when that brutality was connected to serious, organized crime capital. And the man who helped connect those two worlds was one of the most feared killers in New York, DeMeo. By the time Jimmy Coonan had taken control of Hell's Kitchen, he had solved one problem. He had territory. Now he needed scale. That is where DeMeo entered the story. DeMeo was not an Irish neighborhood gangster. He was connected to the Gambino crime family, one of the most powerful mafia organizations in New York. And that relationship changed what the Westies could become. Coonan had something the Gambinos could use. A violent local crew, men who knew Hell's Kitchen, men who understood the bars, unions, contractors, waterfront businesses, and criminal networks of the West Side. The Westies could operate in places where an outside mafia crew might attract more attention. But Coonan needed something in return: money, protection, recognition, the kind of backing that could make a small gang much harder to challenge. Federal court records later showed that the Gambino family financed the Westies' loansharking business. That meant capital, money that could be lent out at illegal interest, money that could circulate through the neighborhood, money that came with a much larger name behind it. The Westies were also allowed to invoke the Gambino reputation in their own dealings. That may sound symbolic. It was not. In organized crime, a name can function like collateral. If someone believes a debt is connected to a Gambino-backed operation, the consequences of refusing to pay become larger. The Westies were no longer threatening people only with Jimmy Coonan. Now they could imply something behind him. A family with deeper resources, more killers, more political connections, more influence across New York. In exchange, the Westies paid the Gambinos a percentage of criminal proceeds. Court records describe that share as 10% from various illegal activities. That arrangement tells us exactly what Coonan was doing. He was trading independence for power. And that is one of the most important parallels with State of Grace. In the film, Frankie Flannery has to deal with a larger Italian mafia structure. The relationship is humiliating because Frankie understands what it means. He can call himself the boss of his neighborhood. But the Italians operate on another level. That tension was rooted in real organized crime economics. Coonan may have controlled Hell's Kitchen. The Gambinos controlled something much larger. So the alliance was not between equals. It was a business arrangement between a local Irish crew and a mafia family with national reach. DeMeo became one of the men who helped bridge those worlds. Later histories describe DeMeo and Coonan as close criminal associates. They also connect DeMeo to the killing of Mickey Spillane in 1977, often describing the murder as a favor that helped Coonan consolidate control. That version is widely repeated, but it should be treated as underworld history, not as a courtroom finding that Coonan personally ordered Spillane's death. What is much clearer is what happened after Spillane was gone. Coonan emerged stronger. His Gambino relationship deepened, and the Westies gained access to money and reputation that no neighborhood crew could have created alone. But there was a cost. Once the Westies became connected to the Gambinos, they became part of a larger criminal hierarchy. More money entered the system. More rackets became possible, but more obligations came with them. Payments had to move upward. Orders mattered. Relationships had to be maintained. And the Westies' violence was no longer only about defending Hell's Kitchen. It became part of a broader, organized crime economy. That was good for Coonan. At least at first. The alliance gave him what Mickey Spillane had resisted: a way to survive beside the Italian mafia instead of fighting it. But not everyone in Coonan's crew was comfortable with that trade. Mickey Featherstone, in particular, would eventually see the Gambino relationship very differently. To Coonan, the alliance was leverage. To Featherstone, it could look like surrender. And that disagreement would matter later. For now, the important point is this: the Westies had crossed a line. They were no longer just the most feared Irish crew in Hell's Kitchen. They were now plugged into the financial and criminal infrastructure of the Gambino family. And once that happened, the gang could make money in ways that went far beyond street violence. The Westies did not sell one product. They sold access, debt, fear, and control. That distinction matters because a criminal organization becomes much harder to destroy when its income does not depend on a single business. Start with loansharking. Jimmy Coonan supplied money to members of the gang at high rates of interest. Those members then loaned the money again to people in Hell's Kitchen. The money moved downward. The interest moved upward. And when somebody stopped paying, the collection process did not involve a bank. It involved the Westies. Federal court records describe violent collection methods. Debtors were beaten, threatened, humiliated. In one case, a delinquent customer was stripped, beaten, and left tied to a tree. In another, A borrower was pistol-whipped after missing payments and insulting the gang. That is the basic economics of loan sharking. The interest is profitable. The fear protects the interest. Then there were narcotics. By the 1980s, members of the Westies were involved in cocaine distribution operations. Some controlled distribution in Manhattan bars. Others supplied cocaine or financing to fellow gang members. Again, the structure mattered. The organization was not simply selling drugs. It was supplying capital, product, enforcement, and collection. Then came the unions. This was where neighborhood power became institutional power. Westies members extorted jobs, union memberships, and payments from labor organizations. Court records describe their influence over International Longshoremen's Association, Local 1909, and Teamsters Local 817. That meant the gang could profit without owning the business. A legitimate company might believe it was dealing with a union, but criminal influence inside that union could determine who got work, who received membership, and who had to pay. The West Side piers were especially valuable. The waterfront was an economic choke point. Cargo moved through it. Jobs depended on it. Businesses depended on those jobs being filled. And whoever influenced the labor system could create opportunities for extortion. One case shows how violent that control could become. Vincent Leone was an officer of ILA, Local 1909, and a Gambino associate who helped oversee criminal activity on the West Side piers. When the Westies discovered that Leone had allegedly been skimming money from pier profits, Coonan wanted him killed. Leone was murdered in 1984. Afterward, weekly payments from the union continued flowing toward Westies members. That is not random violence. That is succession inside a criminal revenue stream. One man is removed. Another collection system replaces him. The money keeps moving. And that is the real answer to what the Westies actually sold. They sold money at illegal interest. They sold narcotics. They sold protection. They sold influence over jobs. They sold access to unions. They sold fear to anyone who thought about resisting. And with Gambino backing behind them, even a relatively small Irish gang could make its threats feel much larger than its numbers. That is why State of Grace captures only part of the truth. The movie shows guns, loyalty, betrayal, and neighborhood pride. The real Westies also had ledgers, payments, loans, union memberships, drug distribution, weekly collections, and criminal arrangements that could continue even while Jimmy Coonan himself was sitting in prison. That is what made the organization dangerous. Not simply that the Westies could kill, but that they had built systems where killing could protect cash flow. And once violence becomes part of the accounting, the line between gangster and businessman disappears completely. State of Grace is brutal, but the real Westies were worse for one simple reason. The movie has to make the violence mean something personal. The real organization did not. In State of Grace, almost every killing feeds a family tragedy. Frankie Flannery kills to protect his position. Jackie lashes out because he is unstable and loyal. Terry is trapped between old friendships and the law. Kate watches the men around her destroy each other. That gives the violence emotional structure. The audience understands who betrayed whom, who loved whom, who failed whom. Real organized crime is rarely that clean. The Westies did not exist to create a tragic family story. They existed to make money. That difference changes everything. Jimmy Coonan was not simply defending a brother. He was running an enterprise. Mickey Featherstone was not simply a wild sibling who embarrassed the boss. He was Coonan's second in command. The Gambino relationship was not just a humiliating dinner with Italian mobsters. It was a financial arrangement. The Gambinos provided loan sharking capital. The Westies could invoke the Gambino name, and money flowed upward in return. The violence protected that system. That is where reality becomes colder than the film. In the movie, a murder can feel like the result of anger. In the Westies world, murder could solve a debt, protect a revenue stream, remove someone accused of skimming, silence a witness, or strengthen the gang's reputation enough that future victims would cooperate without being attacked. That is not melodrama. That is management through fear. The film also reduces the Westies world to a handful of recognizable characters. Frankie, Jackie, Terry, the Italians, a few neighborhood soldiers. The real government case was far wider. Federal prosecutors later accused the Westies of a pattern involving murders, attempted murders, murder conspiracies, kidnappings, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, narcotics, and other rackets. That scale is difficult to dramatize. A movie needs one betrayal. A RICO case can contain dozens of criminal acts. A movie needs one villainous decision. An organized crime enterprise can keep producing violence even when the boss is not physically present. And there is another major difference. State of Grace makes Hell's Kitchen feel like a closed world, a neighborhood protecting itself from outsiders. The real Westies were not simply defending old Irish territory. They were connected to unions, the waterfront, construction, drug distribution, loans, gambling, and one of New York's most powerful mafia families. The gang's power came from being plugged into systems larger than the neighborhood itself. That is why the real story is more disturbing than the film. Hollywood gives you men destroying a family. History gives you men using violence to operate a business. And eventually, that business began turning inward. Money created suspicion. Status created resentment. The Gambino alliance changed loyalties. And the relationship between Coonan and Mickey Featherstone began to crack. The man who had helped build the Westies into a feared organization was about to decide that the greatest threat to his survival was no longer the police. It was Jimmy Coonan. The Westies had survived a gang war. They had survived prison. They had survived federal pressure. They had survived the death of Mickey Spillane. What they were less prepared to survive was each other. By the early 1980s, Jimmy Coonan had built exactly the kind of organization he once lacked. Money moved through loansharking, gambling, drugs, union rackets, the West Side peers. Gambino backing gave the crew deeper capital and a larger criminal reputation than a neighborhood gang could have created on its own. On paper, Coonan had won, but organizations begin to weaken when the things that make them powerful also change the relationships inside them. And that was happening to the Westies. For Mickey Featherstone, the Gambino alliance was not simply a business upgrade. Later accounts describe him as increasingly uncomfortable with Coonan's dependence on the Italian mafia. To Coonan, the relationship meant protection, money, influence, a way to survive in a city where the Irish mob was much smaller than the five families. To Featherstone, it could look like the opposite. The Westies had fought to control Hell's Kitchen. Now part of their money moved upward to another organization. The neighborhood crew that once prided itself on independence was operating beneath a larger mafia structure. That tension became personal. Featherstone had been there when Coonan was still fighting for control. He had killed with him, collected for him, helped build the reputation that made the Westies feared. But being indispensable does not mean being equal. Coonan was the boss. Featherstone was second, and second place inside a violent criminal organization can become dangerous the moment loyalty starts to look uncertain. The relationship deteriorated. Featherstone spent periods in prison. The organization continued without him. New men gained influence. Old loyalties became less reliable. And the Westies' own reputation for brutality created a terrible problem inside the gang. If everyone knows the organization solves problems with violence, what happens when you begin to think the organization sees you as the problem? That is the trap Featherstone was moving toward. He had helped create a system where witnesses were intimidated, debtors were beaten, enemies disappeared, men accused of stealing could be killed. That system worked beautifully when the threat was pointed outward. It became terrifying when Featherstone began wondering whether it was pointed at him. And then, in 1985, a construction worker named Michael Hawley was shot to death in Manhattan. Witnesses identified Mickey Featherstone. He was arrested. He was prosecuted. And in March 1986, he was convicted of a murder he would insist he had not committed. For a man with Featherstone's history, the accusation was almost impossible to escape. He had already killed. He already belonged to the Westies. He already had the reputation. The government did not need to invent a violent Mickey Featherstone. The Westies had spent years creating one. But this time, Featherstone believed that reputation had been used against him. And worse, he came to believe that the men inside his own organization knew the truth and were willing to let him go to prison anyway. That changed everything, because Mickey Featherstone had spent years being dangerous for Jimmy Coonan. Now he was about to become dangerous to him. Michael Hawley was shot to death in Manhattan in 1985. And almost immediately, Mickey Featherstone had a problem. Witnesses identified him. Police arrested him. Prosecutors built a case. And by March 1986, Featherstone had been convicted of murder. For most men, that would have been the end. For Mickey Featherstone, it became the beginning of the end of the Westies. He insisted he had not killed Michael Hawley. That claim would have sounded almost ridiculous to anyone who knew his history. Featherstone had been one of the most feared men in Hell's Kitchen. He had killed before. He had participated in organized violence. He had helped Jimmy Coonan enforce debts and defend the gang's territory. His own reputation now worked against him. If a witness said Mickey Featherstone had committed a murder, people were ready to believe it. That was the reputation the Westies themselves had spent years creating. But Featherstone believed something much worse had happened. He believed members of his own criminal world knew he was innocent, and they were willing to let him take the conviction anyway. That changes the psychology of loyalty. A gangster can accept danger from police. He can accept danger from rival crews. He can even accept the risk of prison. But if he believes his own organization is willing to sacrifice him, loyalty becomes irrational. Featherstone began talking. Not publicly, not dramatically. He started working with authorities, and his wife, Sissy, became part of the operation. She helped record conversations. Those recordings gave investigators something they had struggled to obtain for years: the Westies speaking for themselves. Not rumors. Not neighborhood stories. Not frightened witnesses trying to remember what had happened. Voices, relationships, knowledge. The kind of evidence that could connect crimes to an organization instead of treating every murder or extortion as an isolated event. Featherstone's cooperation also gave investigators context. He understood how the Westies worked, who answered to Coonan, who collected money, who participated in violence, how the Gambino relationship functioned, which murders mattered, which rackets generated money, which men inside the crew trusted one another. That made him far more dangerous to Jimmy Coonan than any rival gunman. A rival can kill one man. An insider can explain the system. And the more investigators examined the Michael Holly case, the worse the situation became for the Westies. Evidence emerged supporting Featherstone's claim that he had not committed the murder. His conviction was eventually overturned. For the first time, the man who had spent years helping the Westies create fear had proof that the organization's reputation could be used against him. He had been convicted because people believed Mickey Featherstone was capable of almost anything. Now that same man was helping the government prove what the Westies themselves were capable of. The irony was brutal. Jimmy Coonan had spent years building a gang where loyalty was enforced by fear. But fear only works while people believe staying loyal is safer than betraying you. Once Featherstone believed the opposite, the entire equation changed. Cooperation became survival, and survival became revenge. By the time federal investigators fully understood what Featherstone could give them, the Westies had a problem no amount of violence could solve. Their second-in-command knew too much, and this time, he was talking. For years, the Westies survived because every crime looked separate. A beating was a beating. A murder was a murder. A drug deal was a drug deal. A union payoff was a union payoff. And as long as each case stood alone, the organization could keep functioning around the damage. RICO changed that. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act gave federal prosecutors a different way to attack the Westies. They did not have to prove that Jimmy Coonan personally committed every crime. They had to prove that an enterprise existed, that the defendants participated in it, and that the crimes formed a pattern connected to that enterprise. That was the legal weapon the Westies were least prepared to survive. On the 17th of September 1987, federal prosecutors indicted Coonan and 9 co-defendants. The indictment alleged 32 racketeering predicate acts. The list was not limited to street violence. It included murders, conspiracies, loan sharking, narcotics, extortion, gambling, union corruption, and other crimes stretching across years. For the first time, the government was presenting the Westies not as a collection of violent men, but as a machine. Then came the trial. It lasted roughly 4 months. Federal prosecutors called more than 70 witnesses. They introduced more than 350 exhibits. They laid out a multi-million-dollar loan sharking operation, illegal gambling, narcotics distribution, schemes to extort money and jobs from labor unions, and a series of murders. That scale mattered. A single witness can be attacked. A single murder case can collapse. A single frightened debtor can disappear. But 70 witnesses and hundreds of exhibits create something different. Pattern, structure, context. And Mickey Featherstone gave the government the one thing outsiders rarely have: a map from the inside. He could explain who answered to whom, how the money moved, why certain men were killed, how the loan sharking system worked, how the union rackets operated, how Coonan communicated orders, and how violence protected the organization. The government also had evidence showing that Coonan's influence did not stop when he went to prison. His wife, Edna Coonan, relayed important messages to gang members. Federal records say she managed parts of the loansharking operation during periods of Jimmy's incarceration and transmitted instructions connected to criminal activity. That detail was devastating, because it showed that the Westies were not simply a street crew dependent on the boss physically standing in a bar. The organization could continue while Coonan was behind bars. That is what makes an enterprise different from a gang of individuals. The system outlives the location of the boss. By February 1988, the case reached verdicts. Most of the defendants were found guilty on the RICO counts and additional charges. The sentences reflected how seriously the government viewed the organization. Jimmy Coonan received 75 years in federal prison and a $1 million fine. James McElroy received 60 years. Others received decades. Edna Coonan received 15 years and a substantial fine. The Westies had spent years proving that they could survive murder investigations, neighborhood wars, and shifting alliances. RICO attacked something deeper. It attacked the structure that connected those crimes together. And once the government proved the enterprises, the very thing that had made the Westies strong became the reason the case was so devastating. Every racket became evidence of the organization. Every murder became part of the pattern. Every order became part of the hierarchy. Every relationship became part of the conspiracy. The Westies had built a machine. Then the government used the blueprint against them. State of Grace gets the Westies wrong in details, and strangely right in spirit. The most obvious invention is the Flannery family. Frankie Flannery was not a real Westies boss. Jackie Flannery was not his real brother. Terry Noonan was not a historical undercover cop moving through Jimmy Coonan's actual crew in the way the film presents him. Those characters exist because a movie needs emotional geometry. A boss, a reckless brother, an old friend, a woman caught between them. A betrayal the audience can feel. The real Westies did not organize themselves like a tragic Irish family drama. Jimmy Coonan and Mickey Featherstone were not brothers. Their relationship was criminal, useful, violent, and eventually disposable. That difference matters because blood gives loyalty a permanence that real organized crime rarely has. In the real Westies, loyalty lasted only as long as everyone believed the arrangement still protected them. When Featherstone stopped believing that, the relationship collapsed. The Italian mafia connection is another place where the movie simplifies reality. In State of Grace, Frankie's dealings with the Italians are intensely personal. He is humiliated, pressured, made to understand that his neighborhood power does not make him an equal. That emotional truth is close to the real criminal hierarchy. The Westies controlled valuable territory, but the Gambino family operated at an entirely different scale. Coonan's alliance with them brought capital, protection, status, and access. It also meant tribute, obligation, and the reality that Hell's Kitchen's Irish mob was now working inside a larger power structure. That part of the film feels true because the imbalance was real. The movie also gets the neighborhood psychology right. Hell's Kitchen is not shown as random scenery. It feels like territory. Bars matter. Streets matter. Who belongs matters. Who comes back matters. That is exactly how a local criminal organization creates power. Not by controlling an entire city, by controlling the places where people know your name. The film also understands reputation. Jackie Flannery is terrifying not because we see him commit 100 crimes. He is terrifying because everyone around him behaves as if he might. That is very close to how the real Westies operated. Federal judges later described the gang as deliberately cultivating a reputation for extreme violence. Fear did work before violence had to. And in that sense, Gary Oldman's Jackie captures something real about Mickey Featherstone's role, even though the character is not a literal biography. Where the film departs most dramatically from history is the ending. State of Grace needs a final reckoning, a personal betrayal, a gunfight, a man forced to choose between the people he loved and the criminal world that shaped him. The real Westies did not end that way. There was no single cinematic night when everything collapsed. The real ending was slower, recorded conversations, federal witnesses, RICO charge, courtrooms, sentences, one insider explaining the machine piece by piece. Hollywood gives you blood on the floor. History gives you evidence folders. And that may be the biggest difference of all. State of Grace turns the Westies into a tragedy about loyalty. The real Westies became a warning about structure. Because the gang did not fall when one man betrayed another. It fell when the government finally proved that the violence, money, unions, drugs, loans, and murders were all parts of the same enterprise. And once that happened, Hell's Kitchen no longer needed a final shootout. The organization was already dead. Jimmy Coonan spent years trying to become the man nobody in Hell's Kitchen could remove. In the end, nobody had to shoot him. The government simply made sure he would not come back. After the Westies RICO prosecution, Coonan received 75 years in federal prison. The teenager who had once challenged Mickey Spillane had survived the neighborhood war. He had survived prison before. He had survived enemies. He had survived the violent rise of his own organization. He had built an alliance with the Gambino crime family. He had become the dominant Irish mob figure in Hell's Kitchen. And none of that could protect him from an insider who knew how the machine worked. Mickey Featherstone had once been one of the reasons people feared Jimmy Coonan. Now he became one of the reasons Coonan could be convicted. That is the final irony of the Westies. The organization built its power through fear. Fear kept debtors paying. Fear kept witnesses quiet. Fear discouraged rivals. Fear made a small gang seem larger than it was. But fear could not create real loyalty. The moment Featherstone believed his own organization was more dangerous to him than the government, everything reversed. The enforcer became the witness. The secrets became evidence. The hierarchy became a RICO enterprise. And the reputation that had protected the Westies for years became a roadmap prosecutors could follow. Hell's Kitchen changed too. The waterfront economy that had helped create generations of rackets declined. Redevelopment transformed the neighborhood. Property values rose. Old bars disappeared. The streets that once gave local gangsters their identity increasingly belonged to a different New York. The Westies did not vanish because Irish organized crime suddenly became impossible. They vanished because the specific world that had sustained them was collapsing at the same time the federal government destroyed their leadership. That is why the real ending of State of Grace was worse than anything Hollywood could stage. The film ends with bullets. The real story ends with something colder. A criminal organization realizing that terror cannot protect it from its own memories. Frankie Flannery never existed. But Jimmy Coonan did. Mickey Featherstone did. Ruby Stein did. The bodies were real. The rackets were real. The Gambino alliance was real. And so was the betrayal that helped bring the Westies down. State of Grace turned that history into a tragedy about brotherhood. The real Westies left behind a different lesson. A criminal empire can survive enemies. It can survive arrests. It can even survive murder. What it cannot survive forever is the moment the men who know its secrets decide they have more to gain by telling them.